Grace. I'm a researcher at the IMPR. We're a kind of centre-left think tank, and I work on our Commission on Economic Justice, which is a 2-year programme looking at the kind of structural issues within the UK economy and coming up with innovative solutions to deal with them. And if you'll excuse me, I'm slightly croaky. I've just come back from 2 very fun days at a very festive, unusually festive Labour Party conference. So yeah, sorry about my voice. So I'm just going to start. I'm just going to talk a bit about a kind of intellectual history of neoliberalism, as far as I kind of understand it, and then I will talk a little bit about my specialism, which is the British economy. What are the kind of the underlying structural issues, and how do they relate to the kind of economic wisdom of today? So let's start by having a little bit of intellectual clarity about what neoliberalism is. I've got David Harvey's definition here, and David Harvey's written a book called literally Neoliberalism, so it's kind of seminal work on the subject. If you'll permit me to read out a fairly long definition. Neoliberalism is, in the first instance, a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterised by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. Now, anyone familiar with kind of, philosophy or general economic history knows that that's not a particularly new idea. It dates back for quite a while. But its particular instantiation, as it is now, dates back to kind of the monetarists in the 1980s. So in the kind of 60s and 70s, you have what was called the post-war consensus, built on the work of Keynes, who wrote a lot about the post-war consensus was built on a kind of a fairly interventionist role for the state, but primarily what Keynes was interested in was investment and therefore interest rates and the money supply. So the Keynesian view was in order to kind of promote economic growth, stimulate employment, you need to have low interest rates to encourage businesses to invest. And this came alongside Keynes' big innovation was essentially disaggregating the short run from the long run in economics. So he said that even if in the long run everything kind of balances out, in the long run we're all dead, and in the short run there could be kind of deficits of demand that are created by kind of irrational market forces. So you need state investment to kind of smooth those things out. And in the background throughout the 60s and 70s, you have this broadly shared prosperity in the post-war period. There were a group of people working systematically to kind of undermine this, and part of that was ideological reasons, part of it was kind of self-interest and other more nefarious things. But these people grouped together at what was called the Mont Pelerin Society. So this was a society in Switzerland. They all came together to chat about what they saw as the problems with Keynes and the post-war consensus. And some of these you may have heard of. There was Hayek, Friedman, all the kind of famous economic gurus at the time. So one of the biggest differences actually between neoliberalism and Keynes, aside from all the things we just talked about, so free markets, individual liberty, all that sort of stuff, was their views on money. So the monetarists, hence the name, subscribed to what was called the quantity theory of money. So they believed that the value of money is determined by how much of it there is. Contra Keynes, who kind of basically believed that, as I said, you needed to have low interest rates in order to promote investment generally. The monetarists thought that the primary role of the state was to guarantee the value of money, so kind of put limits on the amount of money being created, and to keep interest rates high in order to prevent inflation, because, well, they argued that inflation hurts ordinary people, which is of course true. And the monetarists were working in the background for a long, long time. Hayek was writing The Road to Serfdom, Friedman was kind of engaging lots of different people, and they had a really coherent vision for what they wanted, which was, as I said, free markets, individual liberty, controls on the value of money, all that sort of stuff. And they also had a really coherent vision for change. So they were in Mont Pelerin. They were like, how do we completely and utterly undermine public wisdom on what economics is and should be? And they set up a network of think tanks. So, I worked for a think tank, but on the left, there was a lot of think tanks that emerged in the 70s and 80s. The IEA, for example, was set up by Mont Pelerin to just completely change the public debate on economics and start bringing in all these things that we now kind of count as as economic common sense. So, you've got to pay off your debt, and the state should stay out of your lives as much as possible. All that kind of common sense does date back to this particular monetarist view, neoliberal view, they came about during the 70s. And they also influenced a series of politicians, as we know, and they used the crises of the 1970s, so you had the two oil shocks, combined with a balance of payments crisis in the US and serious labour market crisis in the UK. And these kinds of paradigm shifts always require crises to kind of embed themselves. So after that crisis, you get Thatcher coming to power in the UK, and you get Reagan coming to power in the US, and they start really implementing some of these neoliberal reforms. So privatisation, labour market reforms, kind of consistent attacks on trade unions, very high interest rates. In the 80s, you have the Volcker shock, where interest rates go up massively in the States, and aside from kind of all the misery that created in the US, it led to a debt crisis all around the rest of the world as capital flooded back into America. So and this also was another kind of increase in the rate of change in terms of globalization, in terms of the interconnectedness of the world, and the current type of globalization that we see now was really embedded during the 1980s. So this was all about free movement of capital as opposed to free movement of labour. So keeping labour in one place but allowing capital to kind of roam all around the world, promoting financialisation and creating kind of very financialised economy in the City of London and also on Wall Street. And so these reforms did, do what they were supposed to do. They dealt with the inflation crises, currency problems, but at the cost of decimating the UK's manufacturing base, hurting particularly the regions, creating mass unemployment and dramatically increasing inequality. And obviously the integration of the UK into international capital markets sealed the deal in terms of the power of finance over our economy and also our politics. And then, of course, as Thatcher liked to say, her greatest success was Tony Blair. So by 1997, this wisdom was really very much embedded. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, broadly speaking, this shift from Keynes to Hayek can be described as a paradigm shift. So it's a change in the common sense, change in the way in which people view the world, how economics is discussed, how we think of the state, our very concept of what it means to have a kind of a strong economy was transformed during this time, partly because of the coherent work of people like Hayek and Group behind the scenes, but partly because of this sense of crisis that came about in the 80s. So the question is, I think, the title of this debate is neoliberalism, end of the line, right? So are we coming to the end of neoliberalism? And I think to ask that, we have to ask ourselves, are we at a similar moment of paradigm shift right now? In terms of the kind of stuff behind the scenes, you certainly had an explosion of kind of new thinking in economics since the financial crisis. So over the last 10 years, what we call heterodox economics has really taken off. And I mean, you've got in Manchester the work of post-crash economics and debunking economics, looking at all the kind of systemic failures of the economics establishment, particularly in academia, to deal with a lot of the questions that are faced in the real economy. But ultimately, as I mentioned, crises are really needed for change to happen. So are we currently in a moment of crisis? And this is where I come on to some of the work that I've been doing as part of the Commission on Economic Justice. So to kind of go back to some of what we've just heard, so GDP is allegedly going fairly strongly. Employment is actually the highest it's ever been since records began, partly because you've now got more women involved in the labour force, but even unemployment is at record lows. So the task of the Commission has been to say, okay, well, if everything's going so well, then why is there this pervasive feeling that actually things aren't that great? And the story of our interim report is basically that aside from GDP and employment, when you look below those headline figures, there are some serious structural issues with the UK economy. And this is why there isn't this sense that actually of prosperity and that things are going well, especially everywhere outside London. So just, if you'll permit me, some fun stats. This has been the slowest recovery of any major recession since the 1970s. At a corresponding stage of recovery, in 1970, GDP was 6%, 1980, 19%, and the 1990s, 18% higher. And so, this is the familiar business cycle that some of you will have heard of. Generally, you'll have a crisis, GDP will go down and it will come back up again. This hasn't happened this time, and that's really quite remarkable. Productivity, which is the only thing you can really rely on to increase economic growth over the long term, has stagnated, as many of you know. It's now 13% below the G7 developed economy average. Employment may be at record levels, but people work fewer hours than they would like. There's about 8% underemployment. The number of people on 0 hours contracts has increased more than 500% since 2007. Self-employment has increased from 13% of the workforce to 15% today, in 2008, sorry, to 15% today. And self-employed people earn, on average, much less than they did 20 years ago. So this is the phenomenon of false self-employment in the gig economy. The really, in many ways, tragic thing has been the story on wages, and we've seen some of this recently. So median wages today are only 5% higher than they were in 2007. And real wages now, so that's wages accounting for inflation, so what people are going to use those wages to buy, have now been negative. And this has been the longest period of wage stagnation since the 18th century. So this is really quite remarkable. Alongside this, and this is something I'm particularly passionate about as well, there's been an explosion in household debt. So this is obviously tied to the stagnation in real wages, but it's also tied to the kind of explosion in what is essentially usury we have now. So there's this idea in kind of neoclassical economics that the rate that the Bank of England charges on interest, which is historically low levels, is the rate paid by consumers, and that's why you get greater borrowing and more economic activity when you have low interest rates. But actually, the transmission mechanism is completely short, and as any of you who have a credit card know, we're paying 20, 25, 30, sometimes 500% interest on our debt, which leaves people kind of trapped in this spiral of indebtedness. And average household debt now stands at 142% of household income. If this continues, household debt will surpass its 2008 peak in under 3 years' time. And as we know, the financial crisis connected to the real economy in the form of a debt crisis. But this bleak picture doesn't actually reflect the experience of everyone in the UK. So company chief executives are now paid 150 times the salary of the average worker, up from 20 times just 30 years ago. Between 2010 and 2015, average pay for FTSE 100 directors rose 47%, often unrelated to the performance of their companies. And actually only 10% of the wealth generated since 1979 has gone to the bottom 50% of the income spectrum. So 50% of people on the bottom have got 10% of growth we've experienced in 79. And when you look at the geographical spread of these stats, then it's even starker. The UK is now the most regionally unequal country in Europe, with 40% of our national income produced in London and South East. Median incomes in the North West, the West Midlands, the South West and Wales are more than 40% lower in London. So, all this sounds very bleak, but is it quite enough to create a crisis? And the answer is no, right? You can have a steady, secular trend slow down the economy without creating a crisis. But there are also severe issues in financial markets at the moment. So when you look at market capitalization to GDP, so the amount of money that's in financial markets, without getting too technical, the capital markets have become much more volatile as partly a result of quantitative easing, which has involved the Bank of England printing lots and lots of money, well, kind of, but with computers, so not with printing presses, and essentially giving it to banks, which use that for their speculation and channeling that money into capital markets, which has created a series of bubbles in lots of different sectors, which could potentially pop at any time. So on their own, these two issues, the financial market instability and huge levels of debt in finance markets, and the structural weakness of the economy, if those two things were happening in isolation, you wouldn't potentially be that worried. But the fact that they're both happening together at the same time means that we could be heading for 2008 2.0 at any point. All it ever really takes to kind of spark off these things is a catalyst. And we have the catalyst par excellence on the horizon in 2 years when we finally leave the European Union. So that could potentially be the crisis that allows for that creates the end of neoliberalism, essentially. You mentioned earlier that the 1920s and the kind of the period of laissez-faire that was kind of almost the first instantiation of liberalism or liberal economics. And at that time, there was a man writing called Karl Polanyi, who's had a bit of a resurgence recently, partly because everything he says when he's writing about the 1920s seems to apply today. And aside from all the kind of other amazing arguments he makes, what he says is that neoliberalism, or liberalism at the time, laissez-faire, is a hegemonic utopian project, right? It has this idea that basically you can treat people as if they're commodities, and you can kind of force huge amounts of kind of suffering. You can ignore laws of necessity. You can make them work for almost nothing in order to promote some abstract concept of human freedom, right? And that is essentially a utopian project. But when you actually try and implement it, there's only so much that people can take. And eventually, you will come to a wall and people will start to react against that utopian project. And all it takes is a crisis. And I would argue that we are on the cusp of such a crisis. Whether or not neoliberalism is replaced with something more, transformative or just kind of continued chaos is, I would argue, up to us. So, thanks very much.